Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker this evening, Professor Alec Ryrie.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you all for being here. What I want to talk to you about this evening is our culture war, or because this is what I think underpins what we call our culture war, our values war. And I should say, first of all, that what I'm going to say is mostly drawn from this book, which was published a few months ago. It's a book, though, that I would never have written without my years as Professor of Divinity at Gresham, so it feels only right to bring it back here to close the circle. So, in 1947, the American radio network, ABC, began broadcasting this series under the modest title, The Greatest Story Ever Told. It ran for nearly 10 years. It was broadcast in over 50 countries. It spawned a novel and eventually an epic star-studded movie. And the story was, of course, the story of Jesus Christ, which was still, up to the mid-20th century, the defining sacred story in American, in British, in Western culture more generally. And this is a story that was told and retold, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was so deeply familiar. Now, earnest Christian believers were very much a minority in both Europe and America in this period, but everybody recognized the power of this story. You didn't need to believe that Jesus was God incarnate to recognize that he was the most powerful moral figure in this culture. You see that especially from the atheists of the period, who would usually go out of their way to emphasize that they saw Jesus as an exceptional, maybe the exceptional moral exemplar. But by the time the film came out in 1965, it was no longer so obvious that this really was the greatest story anymore. Its global box office of $15 million only covered 3/4 of its enormous production costs. And it got an absolute critical panning, partly because it runs for 4 hours. It's now best remembered for John Wayne's unintentionally comic cameo as the centurion at Calvary. But as the reaction to this show's reverence was no longer the order of the day. And the story that I want to tell you this evening is about that shift, what it meant, what it means for us now, because we've been living through it, but I don't think we've fully understood what it means. And I think that shift is symbolized by one simple change, which is that a century ago, less, the most potent moral figure in our culture, the most potent human symbol of right and wrong, was Jesus. But now, it's Adolf Hitler. Once we had a positive exemplar, a model of who we should be and of what to love. And now we have a negative one, a model of who we shouldn't be and of what to hate. And once we had a religious figure at the center of our values, and now we've got a secular one. Because in our relativist, pluralist age, he is the one reference point, the yardstick by which we know what evil is. Maybe we still believe that Jesus is good, but not with the fervor and conviction that we believe that Nazism is evil. Crosses, crucifixes, these symbols have lost most of their cultural power. You can play with them, joke about them, nobody really minds. But there is no visual image in our culture that packs a heftier punch than a swastika. You play or joke with that, and you make yourself a monster. So to understand the post-war age, I think we need to understand that this has been the age of Hitler. That's what the title of my book means. I'm not talking about the dozen years when he set Europe ablaze, but the long decades since when the man with the toothbrush moustache has dominated our moral imaginations. Now, I do not object to demonizing him. If you are going to find one human being to stand as your representative of evil, I challenge you to come up with a better candidate. But we should be clear about what we've done in replacing a positive with a negative exemplar. We've taught ourselves that evil looks like a Nuremberg rally, whereas, in fact, of course, evil takes many forms. And we've persuaded ourselves that we live in an age which has no religion, when in fact we are believers in the myth of World War II. Or at least we have been until recently. As you might have noticed, our shared secular moral consensus, the consensus built around the fact that we're not Nazis, is starting to unravel. And I also want to talk tonight about how that's happened and what might come next. Now, we didn't switch out a Christian moral system for this secular anti-Nazi one without a good reason. Christianity's moral authority had been decaying for centuries, not least because Jesus' admirers would cite him as a witness against the churches, rather than as the embodiment of their teachings. But what makes that decline terminal is the Second World War, which is the modern age's keenest moral test, and it is a test that the Christian churches fail dismally. Not just because so many of them openly collaborated with or consented to Nazism and fascism and nationalism. Nearly as bad was the slowness of the non-collaborating churches to wake up to what was going on. The most glaring sin was the church's ancient complicity in anti-Semitism. But that's only the centerpiece of a wider tableau of moral failings, which the war mercilessly exposes. The devil's bargain by which Christians in Germany and elsewhere consented to Nazi or fascist rule, this wasn't some ghastly blunder. It was based on a Christian hierarchy of values. Most Christians didn't actually approve of cruelty or warmongering, of mass murder, but they cared more about maintaining the social order, about defending Christianity against its mockers, profaners, and blasphemers, which might include Jews, and about reasserting Christian sexual and family morals. Even groups like the Confessing Church in Germany, who did offer some level of resistance to the Nazis, were generally more concerned with protecting their own independence, preserving their own moral purity, rather than confronting their rulers' crimes. There are a tiny handful of German Christian visionaries, people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who perceived the magnitude of what was happening. But even in the Confessing Church, most of them only argued about details while still being grateful that the trains ran on time and the communists were being kept out. The most important leader of the Confessing Church was Martin Niemöller, who later famously admitted that if it was distasteful that the Gestapo were coming for the socialists and the trade unions and the Jews, well, that was all right because you knew they weren't going to come for you. That was a serious and authentic Christian judgment. That's what made it so unforgivable. When the war came, Winston Churchill and many others tried to cast it as a war for Christian civilization. But the label didn't stick. President Roosevelt found firmer ground with his talk of judeo-christian civilization and of fundamental freedoms which should be defended everywhere in the world. By the end of the war, the Allies were calling themselves the United Nations, fighting for all humanity against tyranny. And then they seamlessly bequeathed that name to the organization that they founded to police this new world order, created to speak for the whole human race, not for one country or one faith. Now, it would take until the 1960s to really bring the implications of that to the fore. But the line connecting the crisis of the war to the crisis of faith that followed is a pretty straight and simple one. The most obvious route that it runs through is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of the first Christians to truly understand what he called the radical evilness of evil. that Nazism represented. That's what leads him to abandon his church's supine politics, and what ultimately leads to his judicial murder by the Nazis in April 1945. But the letters he wrote from prison that are now famous show him groping towards radical conclusions about where this has left his religion. As he notoriously put it, we're proceeding towards a time of no religion at all. Men as they are now simply can't be religious anymore. And this isn't a lament. Bonhoeffer has become so appalled by the churches and their parody of Christianity that he thinks that their demise is actually God's will. Maybe, he wonders, a world come of age has outgrown religion. His hope that religion is no more than the garment of Christianity. A soiled, tattered garment that it's now time to abandon. What's needed, he thinks, is a religionless Christianity. Now, he was well aware that that's not a plan, it's a paradox. If the old garment is flung off, what are you going to replace it with? At the end of his fullest letter on this subject, he says, the outward aspect of this religionless Christianity, the form it takes, that's something to which I'm giving much thought. I shall be writing to you about it again soon. And in the letters, he returns again and again to this question. What might be left when you've stripped away hierarchies and forms and jargon and wealth and power and have left a Christ-like Christianity serving the world in weakness? And the letters are full of phrases like, I'm thinking over the problem, more about that next time. But if he found an answer before the Nazis hanged him, his letters don't record it. His martyr's death is a kind of answer, but it's not really a practical model. But what he didn't expect is that after his death, these inconclusive private wrestlings would be edited and published, and they'd become a manifesto. Their authority sealed by his sacrifice. A certain kind of radical in the 1950s was drawn to Bonhoeffer like moths to a flame. These people represented clarity and urgency. They're impatient with the complacent churchiness that has ignored or belittled the moral emergency of fascism until it was too late. Bonhoeffer's spirit in the 50s seems to be embodied by churchmen like the English anti-apartheid campaigner Trevor Huddleston, or, above all, by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so by the early 60s, some of the most compelling, some of the most authoritative Christian voices out there are advocating not for conventional Christian values or for their churches, but for radical, secular applications of those values. For the Christians who form the backbone of the American civil rights movement, it becomes a point of principle to play down their religious identity, to forge broad alliances that pay no heed to faith. In Britain, the student Christian movement, the SCM, which had led a modest uptick in Christian affiliation in the 1950s, in the 60s it redefines itself with what they call an openness policy. Its new General Secretary, this fellow Ambrose Reeves, who was a veteran of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, a proud ally of Dr. King's, Reeves declared that we can best serve the churches by ceasing to be a religious society. You can hear the kind of scorn around that word. The SCM started to define itself not in religious terms, but by the political causes that it supported. And as a result, it almost vanished. In the 10 years between 1963 and 73, it lost 90% of its members. These acts of institutional self-sacrifice, and there are others like it, are the religious crisis of the 1960s in miniature. This is a time when Bonhoeffer's inconclusive musings feel like a prophetic summons. Lots of Christians in this period suddenly feel that the one thing they can no longer do with a good Christian conscience is assert their Christianity. Once it had seemed almost banal to say that their gospel was the greatest story ever told. Now just saying that felt like sinful arrogance. So When secularists are mocking Christianity in the 60s, lots of prominent Christians rush to join in. They believe more fervently than any scoffer does that the churches are part of the problem. They feel that to assert their traditional beliefs would be exclusive, would be offensive, discriminatory. To the extent that Western societies become secular, one of the reasons is that many Christians consciously and deliberately decided that it should be. But it still doesn't answer Bonhoeffer's question. If religion, that traditional arbiter of right and wrong, is going to be cast off like a worn-out garment, what's going to take its place? In February 1943, this ship, the American troop ship Dorchester, was torpedoed off the Canadian coast. 4 American military chaplains, 2 Protestants, a Catholic, and a Jew, were aboard. And according to the accounts from the survivors, the chaplains worked together to hurry men into lifeboats, and then they distributed life jackets. When the life jackets ran out, the 4 of them took off their own and gave them to 4 young soldiers. And they then joined their hands and sang and prayed together on the deck as the ship sank. And reportedly, the 4 of them were reciting the Shema, the Jewish affirmation of God's oneness, as the waters took them. The 4 chaplains were swiftly commemorated as symbols of America's war for judeo-christian civilization. I have to say, every time I tell that story, I've done it a lot, I still struggle to get through it without a catch in my throat. And because I normally try to display the cynicism that people expect from professors, this is embarrassing. I have to tell myself not to be so sentimental. But for me, and not just for me, that story and others like it from the Second World War have a visceral appeal. In the same way, Winston Churchill's speeches have, in this country at least, sunk into our collective consciousness like Holy Writ. Christopher Nolan's 2017 movie Dunkirk, which I admit I also struggled to get through dry-eyed, ends with the dazed soldiers back in the temporary safety of England being handed a newspaper report of Churchill's "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech of the 4th of June, 1940. And in the film, one soldier reads the speech aloud from the paper to his comrade, and he does it without flourishes, stumbling and halting, very much like an exhausted, uneducated man reading aloud a text that he's seeing for the first time. And the scene works because we, the audience, know the speech already. We can hear Churchill's cadences, even as the soldier mangles them. It's the clumsiness of the reading that helps us to hear the familiar words afresh. Normally, the only words that need to be rescued from themselves in that way are the words of Scripture. I have to say, nothing affects me quite as much as the tales of the Second World War. In particular, the narrative of heroic self-sacrifice at the heart of the Christian faith, the story that was once the greatest ever told, I find that doesn't have quite the same emotional purchase. Throughout the Christian centuries, the story of Christ's passion has often had that effect. A great many Christians have found themselves emotionally transported, shattered by the passion narratives. But in our own age, including for many of us who still identify as Christians, that emotional immediacy just isn't quite there, or you have to make an effort. That is, plenty of us still believe in our religions, but often not with the same intuitive immediacy or blithe faith with which we believe in our culture's true religion. The Second World War, the greatest story that we have ever told. The French novelist Laurent Binet calls the war our Trojan War, a landmark, a reference, a source of inexhaustible stories, a collection of epics and tragedies. And it's all that. But it's also our paradise lost. It's our epic of meaning and value, dominated by its endlessly fascinating central villain. More than we sometimes remember, it's the basis for our most fundamental convictions about what's good and evil. In the age of Hitler, in the post-Second World War age in which we live, humanity is our shared faith. The concept of human rights is, of course, much older than that. It goes back to the age of the Enlightenment and beyond, most famously to Thomas Jefferson, who in the American Declaration of Independence said it was self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And yet this claim is a problem. Not only because Jefferson wrote it while holding hundreds of men and women in slavery, but also because it's just factually wrong. Jefferson and a few of his Enlightenment friends thought that the existence of human rights was a self-evident truth. But it can't be, because a great many people in a great many historical settings have not believed any such thing. When he says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, I think he's revealing the doctrine of human rights for what it is. It's a castle in the air. It's a defiant, existential assertion of values. But that's not the problem. The problem is that most of us, most of the time, neither know nor care whether human rights have a solid foundation beneath them. Because like Jefferson, we've simply come to believe in them in their own right. In the post-1945 era, we really do feel that the existence of human rights and human equality is self-evident. We can't prove it to be true, but that doesn't matter, because we know in our bones that it is. At least we do for now. Why do we believe that human beings are equal and all have rights? I mean, even asking the question feels uncomfortable. A questioning of what shouldn't be questioned. It's almost to blaspheme. I think the most honest answer is that we just believe, down to our core, that human beings have rights, regardless of whether we can prove it in philosophical terms. That conviction feels like an answer, but in fact it's the question. The closest we can come to an actual answer is the one which is advanced by the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, a document whose title couldn't emphasize its totalizing ambitions more strongly. And it asserts, rather pragmatically, that human rights are the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And then goes on to explain that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. So this is all about the Second World War. I mean, of course it is, in 1948. How could it not be? The experience of exceptionally barbarous acts and the claim that the common people of the whole world have united around the desire for what are, by no coincidence, President Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. That gives the Declaration its urgency. And its confidence is that of the victors of a total war, who are sure that they have earned the right to speak for the common people of the world. Now, it took a decade and a half for the moral shock of the war to work its way to the surface. I think the most vivid single moment of that was the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, which confronted the world with the horrors it had been trying to forget. But I think the best gauge of how the memory of the war shifts is the movies. The war movies of the 1950s are somber, like The Cruel Sea from 1953, or rousingly patriotic, like The Dam Busters from 1955, or just rip-roaring adventures, like Ice Cold and Alec from 1958. But they don't demonize the Germans, and they don't dwell on Nazi crimes. The depiction of the German army as honorable opponents in The Longest Day from 1962 is underpinned by the involvement of German actors and indeed several former Wehrmacht generals in the production. In the much-loved British film, The Great Escape, Germany's regular armed forces are contrasted very sharply with the Gestapo and the SS, who alone are made to bear responsibility for the atrocities. But what's new about that film is giving villainous Nazis screen time at all. But over the following decades, cinematic Nazis become increasingly sinister until, by the 21st century, we've got movies like Fury, in which the entire German war machine is presented as a nihilistic death cult, or Inglourious Bastards, a fully fictionalized account of an ideological war between Jew-hating Nazis and a squad of Jewish-American Avengers. And then beginning in the 60s, the movies begin hesitantly to tackle the Nazi genocide itself. The Oscar-winning adaptation of the stage play Judgment at Nuremberg comes out in '61, while Eichmann is awaiting execution. The American television miniseries Holocaust from 1978 is what really makes that term a general one. In '87, there's a British TV movie called Escape from Sobibor, which is one of the first productions actually set in a death camp. In Schindler's List in '93, Hollywood finally looks the Nazi genocide in the eye, and there has been a string of Holocaust movies since then. Life is Beautiful, The Pianist, Son of Saul, most recently The Zone of Interest. The appetite for this story is not fading. And in movies that had nothing to do with World War II, Nazis start to appear as villains par excellence. The Illinois Nazi Party from the Blues Brothers from 1980, utterly gratuitous. But what better counterpoint could there be to that film's message of anarchic racial inclusivity? And then there's the Indiana Jones movies of 1981, 1989. The values of our age are summed up by Dr. Jones in The Last Crusade. Nazis, I hate these guys. And by then, Nazism had come to denote any attempt to wield authority over others. Workplace bullies were little Hitlers. Punctuation pedants are grammar Nazis. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance takes a dim view of this kind of trivialization, understandably enough. But I think it's inevitable. Nazis come as readily to our mind as Satan did to medieval Christians. A symbol of absolute evil is just too useful to be left sitting reverently in a corner. If hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, then trivialization is the tribute that flippancy pays to earnest moral conviction. In 1990, the American internet pioneer Mike Godwin formulated his famous law, which is that the longer an internet discussion goes on, the chances that somebody will compare someone else to Hitler or the Nazis inexorably increases. And once it happens, the discussion ends. I think almost nothing else about the internet is still recognizable 35 years on, but Godwin's law still holds. Calling someone a Nazi is literally the final insult. It ends an argument because it's a punch in the face. What can you do in reply other than just hurl the same insult back? In a relativist, pluralist age, that's our one fixed reference point. So you can defend Stalin, you can peddle conspiracy theories about 9/11 or COVID-19, you can claim that most men who are accused of rape are innocent. And if you do those things, you'll probably only boost your online following. But even now, if you deny the Holocaust, you're an intolerable monster. And when you bleat about cancel culture, only other monsters will care. And rightly so. Because to deny the Holocaust is to reject the deepest moral truth on which our society is built. I think the clearest sign of this is the way that World War II has been translated into fully fictionalized settings, reshaped and purified in the process. And it starts during the war itself, as J.R.R. Tolkien was writing what would become the 20th century's best-selling series of novels, The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien is quite right to insist, as he did, that his War of the Ring wasn't an allegory for the real world's war. It's a counterpoint to it. His fear, and he's a veteran of the Battle of the Somme, is that while the Allies might have justice on their side, they would fight with just as much ruthless brutality as their enemies and would be dragged down to their level. And so he wrote a novel that told an alternative story of a war not as it was, but as it should have been, a struggle against a dehumanizing tyrant in which the heroes, despite great temptations, destroy the power to impose tyranny rather than use that power against their enemies. Now, Tolkien knew perfectly well that in political terms that was a fantasy more unbelievable than any elf or wizard. That's why he wrote it as a myth. If we're going to use the memory of World War II to reset our moral compasses, then what we need are purified versions of it, not the compromised reality. And we've been doing it ever since. In Star Wars, the Dark Lord has stormtroopers and jackbooted interrogators, and he blasts whole peoples into nothingness and is then defeated by plucky farm boys in planes. In the Harry Potter novels and films, this Dark Lord pursues a racialized supremacy. He gives his followers a name, the Death Eaters, and a set of symbols that openly mimic the SS. The same vision is there in one of the most compelling creations of the British 60s, the Daleks, villains of the TV series Doctor Who, miniature tanks whose relentless desire for extermination reveals them to be wrecks of life, entombed in metal and in hate. These are the myths on which generations of children in the post-war West have been raised. In them, the brutal lessons of World War II are transposed into morality tales. We are determined to teach ourselves and to repeatedly relearn that this is what evil looks like, even though evils rarely appear in such plain dress. So, if we ask why Christianity went into retreat in the West from the early 60s onwards, I think there's almost a simple answer, which is that Christianity's one virtually uncontested function in Western societies had suddenly failed. Whatever else Christianity had become by then, it was still our society's store of value. Believers, unbelievers alike accepted Jesus' ethics as reflexively as we accept the notion of human rights now. But once a new set of values was in place, once a new lodestone had reset our moral compasses so that what had pointed towards Jesus now pointed away from Hitler, and it's not quite the same. That adjustment of the old coordinates makes the old maps redundant, and so they're abandoned, or just simply and quietly fell out of use. Many people still hold their Christian faith mixed in with the anti-Nazi values of their age. Maybe even tell themselves that their faith is fundamental and that the agreement of their religion with their secular values is a happy coincidence. Maybe we worry that we live in hopelessly divided societies, that we're fractured irreconcilably, and we're slow to recognize that we do share a deep, a strong, a pervasive moral consensus, and we're slow because of the ancient inability of fish to know what water is. Our myth is that we live in a secular age. But in fact, we live in the age of Hitler, and our religion is World War II. And now, in the 2020s, it's that faith that's crumbling. The war is losing its moral centrality. I think much of the planet is reasonably enough reluctant to accept that universal values were defined for all time by the victors of a war between colonial powers. Even in the Western world, on the left, the growing intuition that racism is the defining evil of our time has meant that the Nazis' racial tyranny looks like only one example amongst many. Slavery, imperialism, apartheid, just as terrible. The post-1945 instinct that anti-Semitism is a case apart, is an exceptional evil. That's been dulled, not least as Israel has for many people been reclassified from victim to villain. Whereas on the right, of course, the long-shared determination that any hint of fascism is unacceptable, that's been crumbling for 2 decades and more. And it's easy to vilify various political opportunists who've built their careers on populist race baiting and defiance of taboos. But these people have sprung up like weeds in every Western democracy. They are the symptoms of an erosion, not its cause. I have to say I'm unfashionably and counterintuitively encouraged by some of these developments. Not that I disagree with the values of the age of Hitler. I just don't think they're enough. Our myths of World War II have taught us some crucial lessons, but also some misleading and even toxic ones. that evil usually appears in the guise of a dark lord, that it's best confronted with violence, that prudence, forbearance, and discretion, that these things are merely appeasement. As Tolkien could have told us, building our values around a war is unwise, because even a just war is in itself a very bad thing. The anti-appeasement principle, perfectly sensible rule of thumb. The argument that rewarding bad behavior only encourages it, absolutely sound. But as any parent knows, there is more to dealing with bad behavior than never yielding an inch to it. Sometimes you hold the line, sometimes you pick your battles, sometimes you're persuaded to see another point of view. Sometimes you diffuse aggression with affection, or you deflect it in some other more harmless or even useful direction. Escalation is only one of the options available, and it's rarely the best one. From the Suez Crisis to the Iraq War, never mind the near apocalypse of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have learnt that an absolute refusal to consider anything that looks like appeasement can lead to some very dangerous places. And more fundamentally, replacing a positive exemplar with a negative one has come at a heavy cost. It's taught us what to hate, but not what to love. Our culture assures us that we're each free to pursue our own good, but quite deliberately, it gives us no resources to discern what that good might be. It tells us that we have rights and freedoms, which is wonderful, but what are they for? Not presumably just for denouncing each other on social media. But to get past that, we would need gentler virtues and maybe sharper insights than the value systems of the post-Nazi era give us. We'd need to recognize that evil is infinite in its varieties, that Nazism is only one of its flavors, that it's distributed, not personified, and it's usually rooted inside ourselves. You can't defeat it by jumping into a Spitfire and shooting at it. But for now, we are mostly trying to deal with this breakdown by shouting at and being scared of each other. Scared because we quite rightly feel that the whole direction of our culture is suddenly up for grabs, and things that we could take for granted, we no longer can. And that's how we get a culture war. So on one side, you have a brittle version of human rights being taken up in particular by secular progressives who defend freedom of speech by insisting ever more rigidly on what can and can't be said, who sing their old songs louder and louder while waiting and hoping for the madness to pass and the sensible people to be put back in charge. And on the other side, a resurgent conservatism that isn't really conservative rediscovers the intoxicating power of identity politics and looks back into Christianity and other deep-seated religious or national value systems, not looking for serious moral renewal, just for sticks with which to hit the other side. So you have a shrill, panicky parody of anti-Nazi values versus a crude, weaponized parody of traditional values. And both sides end up animated chiefly by their loathing of each other and producing leaders whose main value is their ability to rile up the other lot. And surely it's obvious that we need both. In this century, we are going to face things like climate breakdown, economic, demographic turmoil, artificial intelligence, to say nothing of good old-fashioned nuclear weapons. The values that we learned from the Second World War are going to be essential for confronting those evils. If you are one of those conservatives or traditionalists who is impatient with our endless obsession with the Nazis, well, fair enough. But the point isn't to forget the moral lessons that World War II taught us, the lessons that we encoded in the modern system of human rights. We learned those lessons the hard way, and we paid a heavy price for them. It would be best not to have to go through that process again. But the good news, and again, I'm talking to the conservative side of the audience here, is that you don't need to forget those values. You don't need to fight your culture war on the other side's terms, offering them the kind of opposition that they crave, showing them that you've learned nothing and forgotten nothing. You have a better option because you have something that they don't. your traditions have much, much more to them than thou shalt nots. I mean, of course they do. Otherwise, you'd never have embraced them yourself. You don't need to browbeat people. You can seduce them. Your traditions, and I'm thinking especially of religious traditions here, but not only of them, have got depth and flourishing and satisfaction and clarity and peace and joy to offer. The problem with the post-Nazi values isn't that they're wrong, but that they're insufficient, thin, grey gruel compared to the taste and richness of these deeper, older traditions. It's a culture that only knows what it hates. You can show it something worth loving, can't you? Whereas if you're one of the progressives who wants to hold on to the anti-Nazi value system and all the hard lessons we've learned from it, well, absolutely, you should, you must. But again, it's not enough. There are reasons why that cause has felt like it's been on the back foot for so many years. It's become miserably unambitious. The traditionally anti-Nazi political establishments have become the true conservatives of our time. The people who argue that the world as it stands is about as good as it's likely to get, bar a little bit of managerial fine-tuning that never seems likely to seep out very far. It can almost seem sometimes as if progressives are actually hoping for some disaster serious enough to shock these frivolous populists out of their delusions and bring them sorrowfully back to their senses. But COVID didn't do it, the Ukraine war didn't do it, the financial crisis didn't do it. If all of our anti-Nazi values have to offer is technocracy, moral scolding, and the hope of incrementally increased rations someday, can we be surprised if much of the rest of the world wants to take another path? So, and again, I'm now talking to the progressive side of the table, we need some other resources. And that means those deeper cultural traditions, religious traditions, philosophical traditions, things that will show us what to love and not to hate. Whatever the future might hold for us, it's not a universalized metropolitan utopia of the kind that visionary progressives have imagined and reimagined from Aldous Huxley to Star Trek. Human identities, our particularities, our traditions, our spiritualities, these things are not going to fade away or become superficial quirks in some sort of secular metropolitan soup. The abstraction humanity only consists of specific human beings with specific inheritances. Most of those inheritances have more than enough in them both to nourish us and to shame us. We don't need to be defined by them, but we'd better not run away from them, otherwise they will catch us and eat us. If instead we make some peace with them and contain them, we may find that they offer us some of the resources that we actually need. And whatever we ourselves might think, like it or not, those identities matter profoundly to most of humanity, even those of us who kid ourselves that our sophisticated and modern ways are above things like this. Our options are to get the best we can out of those deep-rooted identities, or to relinquish control over them and ultimately over all of us to the trolls. There isn't a third way. Put it this way, our anti-Nazi values are great at separating the world into the black and white of good and evil. And if we're sophisticated, we might think about shades of grey instead. But it's those deeper traditions that can show us full colour. Instead of just passing judgment, they can help us to see beauty. I'm not saying swallow them whole, they're too diverse to make that possible anyway. But make them part of the conversation. They have things to offer. In particular, they teach us some of the virtues that we will most need in order to navigate this century, and which the secular values of our age most conspicuously lack, things like humility and repentance and forgiveness. So, how do you win a culture war? Well, it's a race. Who is going to reach this synthesis first? Who is going to outflank the other side and seize their territory? The anti-Nazi progressive secularists could do it. For them, the trick is not only to respect, but actually and sincerely to draw on those deep, textured, rooted religious philosophical traditions. That way, they don't just breathe fresh life into their own movement, but they give the lie to the populists who claim that they're the ones defending ancient identities against vacuous secularist wreckers. But the religious and the traditionalist culture warriors might beat them to it. For them, the way to win is fully and honestly to own the moral heritage of the post-World War II era, with all its freedoms and its scruples and its responsibilities, all of which are profoundly compatible with those older rooted traditions, but have new and pointed lessons of their own to add. And if they manage to do that, then they'll purge the poison in their own ranks and find that they've arrived at a place where the vast majority of us are ready to be on their side. And truly, I don't believe I care who gets there first. Thank you very much.